Good evening, and happy Halloween. It's been a long time, my friends. Tonight I would like to share with you a tale that has been shared with me that I believe bears repeating. So if you will, let's get right to it. He was born into the world the 5th of October. The day is a fact because the shadow that was his father, though never known to him by that title, did not let him forget that date. The year, however, though speculated, was never shared with him, so it remains unknown. Being brand new to the world, he did not know mistrust nor bias. He needed only to be nurtured, embraced, and loved. If given these necessities to which we all deserve, this tale would have been much more pleasant to share with you. To call the shadow a man would be an insult to all men who act accordingly. What happened to his mother was never truly known, and she was never once whispered on the lips of the shadow. There is no detail regarding the first few years of his life, as no one was witness to it but the shadow and the boy himself, who was too young to remember any happenings from that time. So our tale shall begin upon the earliest memories of our young fellow, as shared to a welcoming ear some years later. He recalls the sound for the first time. The sound of skin striking skin. The hand of the shadow quickly and solidly connecting with the side of his face. After multiple attacks of this nature, he would end up on the ground, where he proceeded to feel the boot connected with the giant shadow of a man make contact with his rib cage and belly repeatedly. This was always accompanied by an incoherent mumbling from the shadow that sounded like a language not his own. When what felt like an eternity would pass, the shadow would complete his punishment and walk away, still mumbling, and leaving the boy on the floor, curled in a ball, writhing in pain, swallowing his own blood, and wondering what he did to deserve such a treatment. He knew he must have done something wrong, for why else would he have to face these angry actions from one he knew must love him? The beatings occurred frequently, as he recalled. He received extra attention every 5th of October, his birthday. And even when this ritual was not being conducted, the smell of it was always in the air. He knew it could happen at any given time. And it did. His only solace would come in the dark hours when the shadow was passed out for the night. He would spend most of this time alone in his room, staring out the window of the rundown shack which resided just upon the entrance to what the boy always thought to be a vast universe of endless dark woodland. This was his home. This was their home. He would stare out this window, dreaming about what may be out there for him. There had to be more than the little world he knew, he thought. He was rarely afforded a trip out where he could see others and they could see him, you see. And when not receiving the wrong kind of human interaction, he was mostly left with just his imagination, which he came to enjoy and occasionally wished he could share some of the brilliant stories he conjured up in there. As the night grew later, he would silently walk out of his dark and dusty room and make his way to the kitchen area, which was barren of food during the day, and try to find something, anything to eat. The shadow, it seemed to him, was not one who thought of or even saw necessity for food. However, come night time, there were usually a few scraps of food resting on top of the overflowing trash bin. It didn't matter what it was, he just needed something to tide him over until the next night's scavenge. He would then tiptoe to the disheveled room where the shadow snored grossly as it slumbered. He would stare at it for what felt like hours. Like a good and neglected dog, he still loved what he saw lying there. For it is in our nature to love, even when not loved back. And the dark figure lying there was all he knew and was everything that existed in his world. Good or bad did not matter. He knew no different. It was the two of them, and he thought that must have to mean something. Mornings would come and go, and the cycle of punishment, hunting for food in his own home, and dreams of other places would occupy each in every day. He expected the punishments the same way you or I may expect our first cup of coffee in the morning. He surely deserved these punishments after all, as this adult in his life must know what he was doing, right? Its routine consisted of the same things day in and day out. It would rise from its bed adorned with pale, yellow-stained sheets, stumble over to the bathroom where it would never properly dispose of its work, if you will. And when done there, it would proceed to inflict some form of punishment on the boy, his son, be it verbal or physical. It had no want to send its unfortunate offspring into the world for an education of any kind. An academic education, or simply learning to navigate the ways of the world, would have been a very welcome activity for the boy, as it is for anyone. But it had no want or care for that at all. And when the shadow was done preparing for the day, he would walk out the door and leave. For how long or to where was never known. Upon its return home, there were always scraps of food it would dispose of in the overflowing trash bin. It would then take its place upon the usual disheveled chair and just stare at the barren yellowing wall while sipping some form of brown beverage from a mug which appeared to never be properly washed from its last offering. Its black eyes were empty and appeared devoid of any emotion. The boy observed it often talking to itself, which used to scare him more than anything else about the shadow. He would later recall that even though not fully understanding them, some of the conversations grew very intense. The only thing the boy ever fully understood from these ramblings is that the shadow seemed to be obsessed with cleaning a closet. With whomever or whatever he was talking to, it would come up often. The boy was too afraid to ask questions, and perhaps too young to even understand. And he would sometimes observe the shadow striking itself. This stressed him out even more so, as it was never good to have the shadow upset. But then again, it was never anything else but upset. As time went on, and even as young and as uneducated to the human condition as the boy was, he began to wonder, to himself, what kept this shadow moving about in the world? What kept him waking up each morning? Something just seemed off. He wondered what he offered the shadow in this world, and why it even kept him there. Maybe misery and darkness were the shadow's light. He didn't understand this concept really, but sometimes things just are, even without understanding. Then again, he was too afraid to ask questions. And this was their life until one night the shadow arrived home with, for whatever reason, a cat. Even to the young boy this seemed strange, as the shadow was certainly not one to be mistook for an animal lover. It was a beautiful cat, all white but for the black markings almost strategically placed at the end of her tail that the boy immediately thought resembled a happy smiling face. This brought a warm feeling to his belly and filled his little heart. It almost made him uncomfortable, and this had only happened to him once before. He took right to the cat and the cat to him. The cat would become visibly happy whenever she randomly stumbled upon the boy in the house. She would run to him, tail quivering with excitement for mutual warmth, comfort, and care. She became a fixture at his feet, sometimes almost tripping him. His nighttime missions to the kitchen for food and water now became a mission for two. She seemed to fancy scraps of cheese when he was lucky enough to come upon them. He with his crusts of bread, and her with her crumbs of cheese. They were quite the duo. So little, yet they had so much because they had each other. During the daytime hours, she would sit upon the windowsill gazing at the outside world with an amazing attentiveness and reactions to curiosity to anything and everything that moved. be it birds, squirrels, or simply the wind, romantically taking the lead in its dance with the leaves which just before lie dormant upon the rocky ground. He loved watching this, and often wondered if the cat, too, was sometimes dreaming of what else there might be out there for her, for them. One evening he decided assuredly that he shall call the cat Harpsichord. A mouthful, yes, but it made perfect sense to the boy. From one of his rare journeys out of his home, for whatever reason, the shadow took him along on a business venture to a local saloon. Upon arrival to the saloon, the shadow told the boy to wait in the main room while he tended his business in the back. What the business was, the boy did not know, nor did he question. While waiting, he could not help but become fixed on the silhouette of a man sitting in the dimly lit, smoky corner of the establishment, making noise from a large contraption in which he sat behind. This contraption, he thought, it appeared to be otherworldly, as he had never seen such an oddity before. And the sound it made, it was a wonderful sound. It instantly transported him to another place, a place of light, and it filled him with an unfamiliar happiness and contentment that he was almost uncomfortable to accept. He overheard one of the patrons turn to another and say,
"That gent is a wonderful harpsichord player, hey?"
The words sounded as if they were phrased such as a question and a fact at the same time. Nevertheless, he would not forget the magic and power that the silhouette of a man possessed over him while playing this harpsichord. Or perhaps the harpsichord was commanding the silhouette of the man. He wondered. In any case, he found the same bit of peace and magic in the cat that was now in his company. He had found something he didn't even realize was missing in his life. They bonded, and the boy now felt what it was to be loved. Not the love he thought the shadow must have for him, given the fact that this was his caretaker and he was supposed to love him, but true, unconditional love in the form of harpsichord. They shared their meals, quiet times, and playtime that always ended with the boy laughing, as he thought it was hilarious watching Harpsichord scurry about frantically, but always ending up back at his side or in his lap. He adored how when he spoke quietly and loving to her, the motor in her belly would make a comforting sound. Her eyes would somewhat squint, and she would stretch her paws out, nails protruding, to caress the surface that she lay upon. It was almost as if she was telling the boy, "Thank you," and letting him know that he made her feel comfortable, safe, and loved. The boy wondered how it must feel to think yourself so safe and be free from the anxiety of always looming pain. When did come time for another beating from the shadow, Harpsichord would run and hide under the dresser in the corner of the room. The boy, even when being beaten upon the ground and having pain inflicted upon him, was comforted when he had a moment to see her eyes aglow in the darkness of her safety. He began to realize what a power he had to choose to be gentle and loving, and how fragile these choices are. He could just as easily bring this pain upon Harpsichord. But even the thought of something so cruel being brought upon an innocent animal who shows nothing but love caused him distress. When these thoughts did wander into his mind, he would just hug Harpsichord as hard as he could. Never, he thought. Never. When their nightly feast of scraps concluded, and their bellies were at least almost content, they would both lie there in the dark for some time before falling asleep. The boy began filling this time spinning nightly tales to Harpsichord. He shared with her the stories that he imagined in his head for so many years while staring out his window all alone. And of course, he intertwined real-life stories and experiences of his own, which is how most stories come about. He now had the audience he had longed for, and to him, there could not have been a better audience. And in doing this, he fell even more in love with using his imagination to create stories. After a while, he found he would even remember parts from these stories like they were true events. He would have to think where he had heard something before, or feel like he had experienced current thoughts or feelings previously. Upon recalling that these memories were actually from a story that he shared with Harpsichord, he felt it was a special gift to be able to create such vivid memories that never even transpired in the physical world. They came from his own head. Anyway, he would usually grow tired as the story progressed into the late hours of the night, and with this, he would end the story. Always on a happy note, followed by a kiss on the head of his best friend and whispering the simple words we all say to our loved ones when we go off to sleep each night. Good night, Harpsichord. I'll see you in the morning. And the little motor in her belly fired up and lulled him to sleep. His bedroom was always dark, even during the daytime hours. He preferred it that way. But one particular morning he woke, and though it wasn't any darker than usual, for some peculiar reason, he thought it just felt darker than what he had known. He dismissed the thought quickly, turned over and reached for Harpsichord, as he had grown used to doing every morning. Only her side of the bed was bare. Knowing this was out of the ordinary, he rose frantically and searched around for her. Under his bed, behind the bookshelf, under the dresser in the corner, in his pile of laundry, the kitchen, everywhere. No Harpsichord to be found.
It's gone.
The boy froze.
It was crying at the door incessantly, so I let it out. I watched it wander into the woodland and disappear into the dark.
His heart sank. It made no sense. Harpsichord had never cried to get out and would never leave him like that. She just wouldn't. Though he never questioned the shadow, he asked why it did such a thing. He remembered the response vividly as it echoed in his mind and cut his soul for the rest of his time here. He told him, and I quote,
That's what happens when you love, you little fool. It is a wasted emotion, as it is never returned in the same fashion in which you give.
The boy was confused by this, as he knew that Harpsichord surely did return his love, and then some.
In fact, it gets thrown in your face, and they always walk out the blasted door, leaving you alone with your thoughts and with your pathetic self-pity. You needed to learn that lesson, and I needed to teach it to you. So, I opened the door for her. Now get out of here. You stink, and I can't stand the sight of you.
The boy welled up with tears and walked quickly back to his room to hide his face in his pillow to stifle the tears as they fell. He knew the shadow would not stand for them. It did not matter, though, as a few hours later came the expected ritual. Then it hurt a little extra on that day. The following time period was a state of emotional pain and awakening for the boy. He would find remnants and memories of Harpsichord throughout the home. Her fur in his bed, scraps of cheese he knew she would have loved, gazing out of her favorite window now with an empty sill. And he missed her, almost tripping him at his feet. He wanted so badly to go out and search for her, but he knew that he would become lost in that giant abyss of woodland, making it so he would not be home for her when she found her way back to him. He wondered, and his blood boiled, thinking of how the shadow could be so cold and do what it did. Of all the punishments administered upon him over the years, all the neglect, the spitting and demeaning words, this bothered him the most. All of those other occurrences were all he knew. It was normal to him. But this, how? He wondered. And he now began to feel, for the first time, a true sense of anger toward the shadow. An anger he knew that it was directed correctly. The shadow's rituals against the boy continued, and he began to feel that there were no reasons he deserved such treatment. He had done nothing wrong. He felt what it was to love, and have this love returned. The relationship with the shadow he had always known was now taking on the form of an insult to this love. A personal insult to the beautiful cat that with any given chance she had offered unconditional love and warmth to him when it came from nowhere else. And why? How could it be so cold to that fact? Did he not even wonder where she went or what became of her? Oh, this was the start of a fire. A fire in the pit of his stomach that was being fueled with not only painful sadness of the loss of his friend, but more so with the disgust and hatred he now felt toward the shadow itself. He knew not much of the shadow outside of their own private dwelling. As stated earlier, he knew nothing of its daily excursions into the outside world. It was later told by a casual acquaintance that the shadow was viewed by the adults around town as a small, thin, and perhaps sickly man. His eyes, though sunken into his skull, at the same time protruded from his head as if someone were strangling him. His neck hunched a bit forward on his shoulders, and he walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. He was never cleanly shaven, and was known to have a certain pungent odor. He was not a shadow nor a giant to them. Not at all. He was a frail-looking man who would appear at times for necessities, speaking to no one, and no one speaking to him, though he was seen often mumbling incoherent sentences to himself. He was noticeably off to the townfolk, and there were whispers at times that he was a serial murderer akin to that of Jack the Ripper. Of course, this was just talk around town and usually accompanied with laughter and then forgotten about shortly after. So it was in good fun for them, I suppose. Or at least, they never connected him to any cold bodies. Except, perhaps, one. It was a cold autumn's night when the owner of a local eatery and coffee house in town was taking out the day's trash to the bin at the back of the building as he did every night after closing up shop. This night, as he walked to the back, he stopped suddenly as he noticed, illuminated just enough by the overhead light above the trash bin, a shadow, if you will, on its knees. It was wrestling with something for a moment, and then upon a quick movement of its arms and a slight cracking sound that was just barely audible from where the man stood, it rose from its kneel and discarded something into the trash bin. The owner of the eatery noticed that the shadow had now completed its task at hand, as it now turned to walk back to the front of the building. Quickly, the owner acted as if he had just arrived and walked toward the trash bin, business as usual. The two passed each other, with the owner offering a greeting of,
"Good evening, sir."
The shadow did not return this gesture, but the owner did catch a glimpse of its face. He thought he knew who it was, but he didn't have the limp. Or did he? His own questions caused a quick dismissal in trying to figure out who the man was. As he tossed the day's worth of trash into the bin, it shuffled around what was already in there, and in the dim light above that offered the spectacle of the shadow's actions, it was made evident what appeared to be the tail of a small animal. Upon closer look, he removed the debris he had just placed on top of it, and sure enough, there lay a cat, motionless, head crooked upon its neck, blood trickling from its mouth, and its full black eyes were wide open, blankly staring at what appeared to be nothing, and yet staring directly at him. at the same time. He was sickened by this sight, but more so by the understanding now of what he had just witnessed moments ago. Was it him? He thought to himself. He was just not sure. He looked down one last time, and the image was made more difficult to bear when he noticed the black markings at the end of the lifeless cat's white tail. These markings resembled that of a happy, smiling face, a direct conflict to what he had just witnessed. The beatings had become worse in recent times as the boy tried to resist them now. This infuriated and seemed to empower the shadow even more. It took delight in the boy's new behavior. His usual late-night food scavengers had become less and less, and he noticed he began to look different. He was always thin, but now he began to appear tragically frail, even to himself. And with the swollen bruises upon his face more often, he thought he looked like a monster when he caught the occasional glimpse of himself. He still had hope that Harpsichord would return home, but would she recognize him, he worried. It was the 5th of October. The boy had no measure of time, and we have no accurate measure of how much time had passed since the beginning of our story. No one truly knows. Again, the day was fact, however. It was his birthday, as the shadow would soon remind him. With the harder beatings and more time needed for his body to recover, he had been sleeping a lot later into the morning than he had in the past. On this day, however, this was not to be the case. He was awakened in the waning dark hours to the sound of an incredibly loud bang. The shadow, taking upon itself to wake the boy, must have kicked the door open or shoved it so hard that it made such a sound. He then remembered the shadow yelling,
"Wake up, birthday boy! I've got a special surprise for you today."
This was not spoken as if it were excited for the boy. This was spoken as if the shadow itself was going to receive the gift it had hoped for all year long. It proceeded to rip the blanket from the top of the boy and grabbed him by his arm and threw him out the bed and onto the floor.
"You think you're a tough guy now, do you? Well, it's time we see just how tough you really are."
These words and all that followed were spoken in a shower of spit and sounded as if they were words from one possessed.
"I'm going to introduce you to someone today. It's about time the two of you meet."
The boy, now standing and cowering in the corner of his room, in front of the dresser in which Harpsichord used to hide in these events, was shaking in his tattered undershirt and leggings. One foot was covered in a sock full of holes, while the other foot stood bare upon the cold hardwood floor. He must have been a pathetic sight. The shadow ruffled through the boy's pile of clothes on the floor and behind the door threw a pair of pants at him.
"Put these on, now."
The boy, still waking up and unprepared for what was going on, stared at the pants that lay crumpled at his feet for a brief moment. Before he could pick them up to slip them over his legs, the shadow grew more upset and screamed.
"You know what? Forget it. You won't need them where you're going. You are fine as you are."
He charged the boy, threw him over his shoulder, carried him through the small shack in which he had endured so many years of abuse, and out the door. He tried resisting and squirming free of the shadow's grip, but it just grew firmer the harder he tried, so he conceded. He was carried deep into the woods. The sun was starting to rise now, and he recognized nothing. The shadow was talking the entire time. Oh, it was having a conversation, but now with the boy. He remembers the shadow asking questions that made no sense to him. It would receive no response, but would respond back as if someone had answered it. He felt like what he was hearing were the mumbled words he had heard come from the shadow for years. Only now they were coherent to him.
I didn't clean the closet out because you said not to. You said you wiped it down and that everything would be okay. I left and you said it would be okay.
There were more or less memorable words spoken, but there was the closet again. The shadow now stopped. They were somewhere even deeper in the woods, and the boy was still upon its shoulder. What came next from this conversation he was unwillingly observing horrified him to his core.
You were to have the eye that wantingly gazed back at anyone offering attention. That was going to be yours, and you have it. And as long as I were to keep the boy around, I was to receive the ear. The ear that not once listened to a word that I spoke, and would now have no choice but to listen to every word that I said. That was going to be mine. And yet I speak, and still no one listens. That was our deal. You have the eye and the ear. You see and you hear. All I have is a boy. Your blood in his veins, and through him you destroy. Even in death, it is still about you. But with action comes consequence, that no matter how perfect, shall always ensue.
And with that, the boy was flung to the ground, hitting it so hard that the air was momentarily pulled from his lungs. As he regained his breath, he looked up at the towering shadow that was now gazing down upon him. In this moment, everything around him became clearer than anything had ever been before. It was like he was offered a glimpse into the true sights of the world that one reportedly only sees in their final moments. With the glare of the rising morning sun making its way through the towering trees of the forest, the tips of the shadow's hair were aglow in such a way that it reminded the boy of pictures he saw of dandelions, while still but white puffs of seeds. The hair grew darker as it approached the top of its head, where rooted to the scalp. Its facial features were dark, but framed by a backlight of sun. He only saw jagged cheekbones protruding from a thin spectral face shaped by shadow. Whatever the significance, he thought he never noticed the shadow, his father, as so skeletal. It then uttered more strange words in which he did not comprehend, this time directly to him.
When you see her, which you surely will, make sure you tell her that we have not forgotten her, and that rest will never be hers.
As quick as a snap of a finger, he thought to himself that he had not seen the shade of lips move upon the shadow's face with these words. And he wondered what was meant by, "Tell her we have not forgotten her." Who was the her it referred to, and who was a we? The shadow and the silent member of the conversation he was privy to? Perhaps. The shadow knelt down, picked up a stone the size of an adult human skull, and rose back to its feet. With a breathy laugh, it raised its long skeletal arms to the sky, stone in hands. And in that moment, a horrifying, broken face emerged from the shadows that had painted the scene of the last few moments. Then, with a second's pause, which may have well been a lifetime to the boy, it uttered the words,
You were just like her.
The boy's eyes widened, not so much at the knowledge of what was to come, but the shock as he was now sure that the face looking down upon him was one he had never seen before. And suddenly, everything went quiet. He opened his eyes, staring upward for a moment. He saw nothing, and he heard nothing. Fighting a feeling of paralysis, he forced himself to turn his head. And in doing so, he spotted, in a clearing not far from where he lay, a white cat. The cat started coming toward him, and as it did, he began to hear music. It was a harpsichord. He smiled. And that concludes our tale. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening. It was a pleasure to chat with you again. And if you're out there wondering who shared that tale with him, there weren't that many people in the story that could have known all of that. Well, all I can tell you is, if you truly paid close attention, your answers are in the story. Good night.